Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. We have yet another active stretch of severe weather on tap starting tonight and going through at least Friday for parts of the Central Plains into the Midwest. So I wanted to do a video going over the current state of the atmosphere and looking ahead at some of the forecast products and forecast potential outcomes that we could see over the next few days of severe weather. The SPC has outlined multiple days of severe weather risks starting today, as well as tomorrow and Friday. For now, could see that extended into Saturday for parts of the East Coast or the eastern U.S. But for now, we just have today, tomorrow, and Friday as our severe weather threat days with this active stretch. Normally, would like to do this tomorrow morning, as tomorrow and Friday are expected to be kind of the peak days of this severe weather sequence, but not sure if I'll be chasing tomorrow's threat up in central Nebraska yet, and if I do, I'll have to leave pretty early from Norman and to get up to central Nebraska in time. So wouldn't have time to do a video tomorrow morning, and then on Friday would not have time to do a video because I have some stuff to get done here before heading west for the eclipse that is expected to take place on Saturday. So wanted to at least get a video out today going over the threats for the next few days. Not going to be focusing on today's threat so much. We only have a marginal risk out for parts of Nebraska, South Dakota, eastward into Iowa and Illinois, as that will be mainly elevated activity this evening into the overnight hours, well north of a surface warm front that will develop throughout the day today. Really only a sporadic severe threat with storms in this area, with a sporadic hail and maybe a damaging wind threat. Tornado threat is very, very close to zero, if not zero, because of the elevated nature of the storms tonight. We do have a separate area of severe threat across the Florida Peninsula today. We have a slight risk, level 2 out of 5, for the far southern Florida Panhandle into the northern and central Florida Peninsula. We have a little former tropical disturbance that has now merged with a frontal zone across the Gulf and is going to travel along that frontal zone and help to enhance the low-level wind profiles out across the Florida Peninsula, starting this evening and going through tomorrow morning. Will also spawn an area of widespread convection with some embedded supercells capable of producing damaging winds and a few tornadoes. Not going to be focusing again on that threat. That is a pretty cut and dry threat, but anyone in the slight risk area there across parts of the Florida Peninsula, including Tampa Bay, Orlando, and Melbourne, Florida, up to about Tallahassee to Jacksonville, under the gun for a wind and tornado threat out there today. Tomorrow is when things really start to get cooking. We will have that threat remain through the morning hours in Florida, although the tornado threat will begin to wane going into the late morning and early afternoon hours as surface winds veer out there. But our main severe weather potential area for tomorrow, Thursday, October 12th, is in this slight risk area, level 2 out of 5 from northern and central Nebraska down through eastern Kansas. We have a very potent system coming in, and we could see a widespread area of severe threat up there tomorrow. All hazards on the table with that threat as well. We just have gotten the new SPC update in, and they have upgraded the tornado threat to a 5% across central Nebraska with a 2% area surrounding that. So tornado threat definitely on the table with storms tomorrow. Damaging winds also going to be a threat, as is large hail, particularly in that slight risk area from northern Nebraska down through eastern Kansas. And then on Friday, we have a marginal risk, only a marginal risk at this point, for eastern Iowa, eastern Missouri, into much of Illinois, as that trough is expected to move east, and we could see a fairly classic cold core type setup where we could see some low top supercells with some hail and tornado risk there. Still some uncertainty remains regarding the degree of instability out there, as well as the positioning of the pertinent features. So that's why they only have a level 1 marginal risk out for now, but would not be surprised to see that upgraded if we get some more confidence about those things in the next few outlook cycles. But let's go ahead and dive in now. We will take a look at our current state of the atmosphere. We'll start off, as always, with our water vapor satellite imagery. A couple things you can pick out right now. First thing you see is all this green and white down there in the Gulf. That is associated with convection ahead of that little disturbance that has now merged with a frontal zone across the Gulf. Let me zoom into our visible satellite, and you can really see the swirl there in the western Gulf, those clouds kind of swirling in that counterclockwise direction. That is that little low. I posted about it yesterday on social media. It was down here in the southwestern Gulf yesterday and has since moved off to the northeast and has merged with this frontal zone that is draped across the Gulf of Mexico. So it's basically acting as a frontal low, basically a little area of spin moving along the frontal zone. And that will continue to approach Florida going into the evening hours today and through the overnight hours. And of course, out ahead of that, winds nicely backed, and the low-level wind field will strengthen, and that's why we will see increased low-level shear for a tornadic supercell threat with storms moving onshore across the Florida Peninsula tonight. That is going to also be a factor in tomorrow's threat. It has at least been a factor in tomorrow's threat, but we're not looking at too much of a hindrance because of this tropical system. We'll talk about that in just a second, but this tropical system had the potential to be a real bugaboo in tomorrow's threat across the Central Plains. Again, we'll go into that in detail in just a second. So we've got our low spinning out here across the Gulf, and we've also got another area of swirl out here across the west. Very deep area of swirl there across the western half of the U.S. That is our trough that is making its way into the central U.S. for tomorrow's and Friday's severe weather threat. Take a look at our upper air imagery, and you see exactly what's going on. Very high amplitude feature here, very positively tilted at this point. The flow still relegated to mostly the backside of this trough, so it's still definitely in the maturing phase at this point, but that is not going to be the case as we go through the next day or so. That will really start to take on a more neutral or negative tilt as it moves into the plains. That flow will round the base of that trough, and we will have a very potent trough sitting somewhere here across the eastern Rockies into the central plains come tomorrow, and then move off to the east into Friday. And that is going to be our main focus, main driver of our severe weather threat going into the next couple of days. We've seen some flow start to traverse the Rockies, some stronger westerly flow start to traverse the Rockies this afternoon, and as a result, we've seen a low-level response here in the meantime. We started to see some surface low development out here across Colorado into Wyoming. That will continue to consolidate. As that westerly flow aloft continues to traverse the Rockies, that will really start to ramp up that Lee cyclogenesis process, and we will really get a nice surface low to develop across eastern Colorado, western Kansas, going into the afternoon and evening today, and going into the overnight hours especially into tomorrow. So very strong kinematics associated with this setup. Very strong trough, strong surface cyclogenesis, and those are going to be the driving features for tomorrow's severe threat. Again, that surface low will take shape across eastern Colorado, western Kansas tonight. Warm front will be draped somewhere across probably southern Nebraska going into the evening hours tonight, and you notice that marginal risk was well displaced to the north of that for this evening. That's because that strong warm advection up and over that warm frontal zone will be enough forcing to initiate storm development here north of the front tonight. Again, north of the front, elevated storms. So no tornado threat really with those storms to the north of the front, but there will be a sporadic large hail risk with those storms this evening into the overnight hours in that strong warm advection regime. We've started to see a little bit of a response here at 850 millibars, broad surface, low-level cyclogenesis here. That will continue into tomorrow, and we will see this wind field strengthen here in the low levels, especially across central Nebraska, where we will have some nice looking low-level shear profiles for some supercells that could do some spicy stuff tomorrow as that low-level wind field strengthens. This low-level cyclone, again, will continue to strengthen going into the next day or so as we get that trough to really eject across the Rockies into the central plains. We will see that really nice kinematic profile develop for supercells across the Nebraska-Kansas corridor. All right, let's look at our surface data here. We would expect, now this was going to be the main concern with this setup, especially for tomorrow's setup, at least my concern was moisture return and the quality of that moisture return. A lot of the models were showing mainly just 50s, upper 50s, maybe low 60s dew points, making it all the way up into Nebraska and Kansas for tomorrow's event. But the moisture is a little bit stronger and a little bit ahead of schedule as far as some of the products I'm looking at this afternoon. This is our current surface map for the southern plains. We see a decent swath of 60s dew points stretching all the way across Texas into Oklahoma. That was a worry going into this setup, is that of course, last week we had our severe threat. Associated with that severe threat was a cold front. The cold front kind of pushed all that moisture down into the Gulf, but it wasn't a full Gulf sweeper, as we like to call it. Didn't push all this rich moisture, these 60s and 70s dew points, all the way into the central, even the southern Gulf, as we often will see coming up in the wintertime, late fall, wintertime months. We'll get these real strong cold fronts that will really shunt all this moisture well into the Gulf. Then we'd be talking about some real struggles getting that moisture northward. But that cold front was not all that intense, didn't push all the moisture off too far. So we just had this moisture sitting across South Texas into the northern Gulf, ready to be pulled northward with the advent of a surface low across the central plains, which is exactly what we're getting now. So it's very windy outside today here in Norman, and that is evidence of strong warm advection already ongoing as this surface low takes shape up here in the eastern Colorado, western Kansas corridor. These winds will continue to remain strong today and get that moisture northward. We've already seen significant advection of that moisture northward. Dew points in the 60s all the way up into Kansas. If we go to our central plains sector here, go to the Wichita sector, and you can see we already have 60 dew points up into far southeast Nebraska, 61 there in the far southeast Nebraska corridor, 62 there at that station right there. So Nice moisture, at least for this time of year. This time of year in the fall, we don't need 70s dew points to get the job done as far as severe weather goes. We just want to see at least enough moisture to support a severe threat, and that's exactly what we have, and it is definitely ahead of schedule. These low to mid 60s dew points will continue to advect northward into tomorrow, and we should see a nice plume of moisture out ahead of the surface low for tomorrow's threat. We'll take a look at some model data here in just a second to show you how that moisture field is going to progress, but overall, not too worried with the moisture. And this, as we talked about, this tropical system was going to be a bugaboo possibly for tomorrow's threat. This low sitting out in the Gulf, we don't like to see tropical systems in the Gulf if we want to see moisture return, because if you think about it, that flow spirals counterclockwise around that surface low. Well, the flow here on the west side of the surface low is out of the north. Northerly flow is going to help shunt that moisture back into the Gulf and prohibit a lot of moisture return into the Gulf, or into the southern U.S. But it doesn't appear that has been an issue. We've seen enough moisture get around that surface low and pump its way into the southern plains for now. We really see mostly easterly flow out here across the Gulf, still pulling some of that moisture in and helping it to advect northward as that surface low deepens. So we've had enough moisture make its way around that tropical disturbance there in the Gulf. So that is not going to be a concern. Moisture is not going to be too much of a concern. Also, one of my concerns going off of this was moisture quality, the depth of that moisture. And that is not appearing to be an issue at this point. This is our morning sounding, 12Z sounding from Norman, Oklahoma. And you can see that moist layer here is quite deep. It extends all the way up to about 800 millibars or so, which is very, very deep moisture, especially for this time of year. And here we are at Fort Worth. That moist layer is even deeper. It extends almost up all the way to 700 millibars. So very, very deep moisture. And we like to see that deep moisture instead of very shallow moisture, which means the red and green lines there. The red line is our temperature profile. Green line is our dew point profile. If those would be together for just close together for just a little bit and then they would trail off, that would indicate very dry air, very shallow moisture. But we don't have that. We have a very deep layer of moisture here in the low levels, low to even mid levels here, and that should continue again to advect northward on this low level southerly flow going into tomorrow. So moisture, which was a concern over the past few days, is now no longer a concern. We should have plenty of moisture to support a robust severe threat tomorrow and into Friday. All right, let's look at some model data here. We'll look at the 12Z NAM, and I'm not going to go through our normal comparison and contrast of different models. We usually do the NAM, the GFS, and the Euro with these sort of medium range forecasts. I'm just going to look at the NAM for this particular video, just for simplicity's sake, and the fact that the models, which did have a lot of discrepancy over the last few days, have now come together and really honed in on a single solution. Still some slight differences among the models in the overall location of the pertinent features, but the idea is very much the same, and generally the models are all in agreement on the progression of the next few days as far as the setup goes. So just going to look at the NAM for this one, and we will take a look here starting for today and to show you how that trough will progress. This is our 500 millibar map as initialized at 12Z this morning. For this model run, here is our trough in the western half of the country. Positively tilted, strong belt of flow on the backside of this trough. That will change as we go into tonight and tomorrow. You'll see that flow start to round the base of the trough. We'll start to see a nice consolidation of the core of that trough into a nice compact low. We see a very expansive sort of trough here extending all the way up from Canada, Western Canada, into the southern U.S. at this point. That is going to consolidate. We should get a nice, still quite large, but nice compact, much more compact low, upper low, closed trough making its way into the central U.S. by afternoon tomorrow. This is at 21Z, 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time tomorrow. Nice closed off circulation here. Strong belt of flow rounding the base of this trough. Very strong defluence here in the exit region of this trough. That defluence is the winds spreading apart in the upper levels of the atmosphere. We've talked about this ad nauseum before, but the atmosphere doesn't like this when the winds spread apart. It kind of creates a void. The atmosphere tries to fix that by bringing up air from below, and that's how you get large-scale rising motion for ascent in these types of setups. Now, we can even look further here at 250 millibars, which is the best layer to look for our jet stream. 500 millibars is adequate. We'll pretty much give you the same thing, but just to make things absolutely correct, we'll look at the 200 millibar layer for that, and we still see very strong defluence aloft across eastern Nebraska, the eastern half of Nebraska into eastern Kansas there. So we should have plenty of large-scale forcing for ascent tomorrow as this trough makes its way into the central U.S. tomorrow. as a result, we should, as that trough ejects into the central plains, we should have a nice, robust, low-level response as well. Here is our surface map, and you can see as we go through the afternoon and evening hours today, we get a nice consolidated surface low there along the Kansas-Colorado border, and that will be a very well-defined surface low and will be a big feature for tomorrow and Friday's threat. Warm front draped here across far northern Kansas, southern Nebraska, and again, most of the activity tonight will be because of warm advection, strong southerly flow going up and over that front. That will be enough forcing to initiate storms on the cool side of this front. Again, they will be elevated in nature tonight into tomorrow morning, but we should see enough a widespread area of storms tonight north of the front with a sporadic hail and maybe a damaging wind threat as well. So as we go into the morning hours tomorrow, that low will shift off to the east fairly slowly. The trough won't really fully make its way, eject into the plains until tomorrow afternoon, at which point the surface low will really start to move off to the east-northeast. But we should see that surface low throughout the morning tomorrow just kind of meander in that western Kansas, southern Nebraska corridor. And by tomorrow, midday to mid-afternoon tomorrow, we should see that surface low. Here we are at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time, situated somewhere here across southern Nebraska to northern Kansas. Warm front draped here out this way with a cold front. Actually, the warm front might be draped here a little bit farther to the north. And the cold front / dry line will be somewhere here to the south through that pressure tongue, and our surface low situated somewhere there in southern Nebraska. So right ahead of that surface low, we have nice defluence aloft, nice synoptic scale forcing for ascent, warm frontal zone helping to back those winds in the low levels, and that will help really increase the low-level shear up on the surface low for a severe weather threat, potentially a tornadic supercell threat up there across central Nebraska. Let's look at our moisture for tomorrow. So once again, some concerns over the past few days with the moisture, not so much the case today, as we've already had a nice plume of 60s dew points make its way all the way up into southeast Nebraska by this time today. As we're recording this, it's about 2 p.m. Central Time, and that moisture will continue to advect to the north going into tomorrow. Now, the corridor of moisture will be fairly narrow out ahead of the dry line / cold front. Here's actually our dry line, cold front trailing back, and here it appears. So out ahead of our dry line should be a somewhat narrow corridor of moisture, but again, the moisture is slightly ahead of schedule, and that should help overcome some of the capping down here a little bit farther from the main area of large-scale forcing for ascent down here along the dry line to initiate a few storms tomorrow afternoon along the dry line here in Kansas. But our main area where the best ingredients for forcing for ascent are taking shape are going to be on that surface low in that area of strong defluence aloft out here in central Nebraska down into south central and southeast Nebraska. And you see that warm sector is not all that wide. The 60s dew points don't span all that wide, maybe 3 to 4 counties wide at most or so down the length of the dry line from the surface low southward. So not a long duration severe threat where you'd have a very wide warm sector. Not a long duration severe threat, but we do have a wide enough warm sector here, especially along the surface low, to warrant a threat, especially near that warm front just ahead of that surface low where low-level shear will be maximized. So given all that forcing for ascent, we should see probably an arc of supercells develop here along the surface low, probably as early as midday. We see the surface low here in this area. The forcing for ascent in the large scale starts to impinge on this region about this time. That strong defluence aloft makes its way here by about midday. This is 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time, so should see some early storm initiation tomorrow, especially near the surface low. Capping farther to the south will hold things off across central and eastern Kansas until tomorrow afternoon into early evening. But we should see a very, very rapid coverage start to expand there across ahead of the surface low in Nebraska, given all the forcing for ascent. Should see an arc of supercells in this type of environment, so we'll draw our dry line in here. Warm front somewhere in this vicinity here. So let's take a look at our storm mode. Storm mode is critical in these types of setups. So here is our shear vectors. We draw in our boundaries. So our initiating boundary going to be that dry line, and so we can see our shear vectors, especially here across central and southern Nebraska, very much perpendicular to that dry line, to our initiating boundary. That is going to be good for probably an arc of at least semi-discrete supercells. We do have a lot of forcing, so that could compensate for this nice perpendicularity with the shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. But we should see at least an arc of semi-discrete supercells here right ahead of the surface low by about midday to early afternoon or so. Farther south along the dry line as well, we see a decent amount of perpendicularity, but coverage should be much less farther to the south, a little bit farther removed from the strong forcing for ascent. So we should see a little bit more of a discrete mode with any storms that fire there. before things congeal as the cold front starts to push through and catch up to that dry line by evening hours on Thursday. So let's take a look at some forecast soundings here. We'll start at 4 p.m. We'll take some soundings here ahead of the surface low. We'll take one right here, right tucked into that surface low, as that is often the favored area in these types of surface low setups, right on that triple point, the intersection between the warm front and the dry line. We'll take one right ahead of there. We'll take one right here in southern Nebraska as well. And then we'll take one here in central Kansas. And again, the positioning of these features may be a little bit different tomorrow. The NAM does have a bias of being a little bit too slow, a little bit farther west than what some of the other models are showing. But again, the idea is the same. So anywhere from central to northern Nebraska down through central and eastern Kansas should be on alert for tomorrow. And again, we'll see some adjustments in the lines here come tomorrow. But at least the idea is the same on the overall progression of the setup. So here we are, 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time, right on that triple point, right on the surface low. We have a pretty decent environment for tornadic supercells here. We don't see a lot of instability, 800 joules per kilogram there, so not, at least from a surface, just a superficial view, not a ton of instability to work with. But notice it's all down here in the low to mid levels of the atmosphere. 0 to 3 kilometer cape above 120 joules per kilogram. That is very, very strong, more than adequate to really help stretch any spin in the low levels, which should be present right along that warm front, enhanced low-level shear, enhanced vorticity along that warm front dry line intersection. That will be able to be stretched very efficiently into the vertical given strong low-level instability. And we should see a few supercells there, and that stretching of that vorticity into the vertical could provide for a tornado threat with those storms. Photographs might not look all that intense as far as tornadic activity goes, but again, in these types of setups where you have strong low-level instability, and strong spin along surface boundaries, you don't really need a ton of low-level shear for a tornado threat. And this is kind of a classic surface low type setup where you have strong vorticity at the surface, strong low-level instability that should help really stretch that into the vertical and provide for a tornado threat. We could see a large hail threat as well with those supercells. They will be fairly low topped. We do have, all that instability kind of packed in here. Nice fat instability in that hail growth zone, -10 to -30 degrees Celsius. So a hail threat is possible as well. Really robust updrafts with this low to mid-level, strong low to mid-level instability. So a hail threat is in play as well as a tornado threat there. Here we are a little bit farther south, a little bit less instability, a little bit less favorable, a little bit more skinny there. Still have a decent amount in the low levels there, 0 to 3 kilometer cape. About 150 joules per kilogram with that decent low-level shear. Some decent veering of the low-level winds with height, and of course, along the dry line, we could see some stretching of that vorticity into the vertical for a tornado threat with storms farther to the south. Although with southern extent, we will see a little bit less instability, a little bit more capping. So again, 4 p.m. might be a little bit early. We might need to see a little bit more destabilization before we get storm initiation along the dry line. But low-level shear profile is certainly favorable for a tornado threat down there with any supercells that can fire, but should be mostly a large hail threat, I would suspect. And let's go to 0Z, see what happens here. Take a few soundings here. One, again, along the triple point. One down a little bit farther to the south. NAM not showing much instability along the dry line in Kansas. Don't know how much I believe that. We'll just have to wait and see. Looks like the surface temperatures are maybe a little bit cool down there along the dry line. That is a NAM bias. Yeah, 68 degrees. I would suspect that's going to be a little bit higher. So going to just kind of discount this solution, at least for the dry line storms tomorrow. We probably will see a storm or 2 or 3 develop there along the dry line here in the late afternoon to early evening hours, and then the cold front will catch up, and that will really force parcels through any stable air that remains, and we should see an increase in coverage going into the evening hours tomorrow as that cold front catches up to the dry line and really forces those parcels upward. So here we are at 0Z, 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time, and this is really a classic surface low tornadic supercell type sounding. You have, again, instability on the lower side at first glance, only about 800 joules per kilogram, but it's all packed below about 400 millibars or so, all packed in the low to mid levels of the atmosphere. 0 to 3 kilometer cape, about 130 joules per kilogram. That is more than favorable to really help efficiently stretch any spin from the low levels into the vertical. And to top that all off, we have nice curvature in the low level hodograph, strong veering of those low level winds with height. So to me, this just screams low-top supercells with tornadoes tomorrow. Not seeing a significant tornado threat per se, but if this can materialize, decent instability packed in the low levels of the atmosphere, plus a little bit of low-level shear, plus the spin on those surface boundaries near the warm front, right on that triple point. This just looks like a very classic tornado setup for tomorrow. So would not be surprised to see several tornado reports from out there tomorrow. And as I'm going through this, it makes me want to head up there to central Nebraska tomorrow even more. As this is, I love these types of surface low setups where the low level instability really helps stretch that spin into the vertical. So there probably will be a few tornadoes tomorrow, and this setup always seems to produce some surprises or some nice eye candy in the form of tornadoes from low top supercells. Going south into southern Nebraska tomorrow, a little bit higher instability farther south makes some sense, closer to the moisture source, a little bit better heating possibly farther south. Same thing, nice veering of the low-level winds with height, and again, low-level instability over 200 joules per kilogram. Just a classic tornado setup, low-top supercell tornado setup for tomorrow. Would not be surprised to see several tornado reports from up there from an arc of supercells along the surface low. So again, the cold front will catch up to the dry line come the evening hours tomorrow. We could see an expansion of storms moving into eastern Nebraska, eastern Kansas, perhaps southwest Iowa, northwest Missouri tomorrow in more of a line as that cold front catches up to the dry line and really hikes up the forcing for ascent at the surface to really congeal all the ongoing storms into a line. But definitely late afternoon hours up on that triple point. Looks like alarm bells are sounding for sure for me for a nice tornado setup up there with low top supercells. All right, let's go into Friday. Let me go back out, zoom back out to the 500 millibar pattern here. I will go back to tomorrow evening. We'll start at 0Z Friday, so 7 p.m. Thursday. And let's go ahead and take a look at how that trough progresses into Friday. So again, some uncertainty remains with Friday. We could have a lot of storms ongoing in the morning hours from the overnight hours. And given the forcing for ascent, we could see quite a bit of storm coverage going into the morning hours. But in these types of setups, in these cold core types of setups, you don't need a lot of time to destabilize the atmosphere. I'm going to go to the 500 millibar temperature map. You see all these pinks here at the core of this trough. That is very cold air aloft. About negative 14, negative 15 degrees there at the center of the trough. That is quite cold air. And that is why these are called cold core tornado setups, because you have very cold air. That helps to destabilize the atmosphere rather than you have persistent moisture advection or large scale forcing for ascent. The destabilization comes from very cold air aloft moving over the low level moist layer to really increase the instability going into the afternoon in these types of setups. And you'll see as we go into tomorrow or into Friday that the upper low will move east, very tightly wound circulation there. We'll be situated probably somewhere in western Iowa, somewhere in that vicinity, very cold air aloft overspreading here, and that will help to destabilize the environment out ahead of that upper trough. We look at our surface low as well. The surface low will meander off to the east as well pretty quickly. The fronts will probably occlude here, probably some portion of an occluded front here leading up into the surface low. But this is just a classic environment for cold core tornado setups. And I'm going to pull up the graphic here from Davies and Geyer 2004, which is a very, whoops, that was the wrong one there. Davies and Geyer 2004. This is their diagram from their article on cold core tornado environments. And you can see how closely the Friday setup, and even the Thursday setup for that matter, matches this cold core type setup, especially box A here on the left. This is again from Davies and Geyer 2004. I'll put a link to that paper in the description below. This is their figure 9. You can see the 500 millibar closed low with very cold air aloft is in very close proximity to the surface low, which is just off to the east or east-southeast. The fronts leading up into that surface low, your moisture tongue leading up into that surface low, and right at the apex of that, right ahead of the surface low, right at that triple point, is where your best environment for cold core tornadoes tends to exist. And you can see that setup is pretty much, we've got all the boxes checked for Friday. Here is our 500 millibar trough, our 500 millibar closed low there with very cold air aloft situated there in western Iowa, eastern Nebraska. Surface low situated just out to the east, out ahead of that. Very warm, moist air, warm and relatively moist for this time of year, feeding up into that surface low there. And that is a classic environment for tornadic supercells in a cold core type setup, right at the apex of where those fronts meet, right ahead of the surface low. So again, Friday is setting off some alarm bells as well for me for a classic cold core type setup. let's take a look at some soundings for Friday. We should have that moisture hold on as well. We'll have that tongue of moisture just wrapping into the surface low. As that surface low occludes, we should get a nice area of destabilization here right ahead of the surface low, probably somewhere from central to southeast Iowa, maybe depending on where the pertinent features set up. Perhaps as far east as western Illinois, perhaps as far south as northern to northeast Missouri. But somewhere in this vicinity, Iowa, Illinois, Missouri corridor is where we're going to see the best chance for a few supercells again in kind of an arc here. The supercells here in a cold core setup tend to be fairly semi-discrete in nature. Just to test that, we'll take a look at our boundary here. And you can see those shear vectors very much perpendicular to the boundary there. So definitely should be a nice semi-discrete setup for any supercells that do fire here out ahead of this surface low on Friday. Let's take a sounding here out from southeast Iowa, right at the moisture tongue there, right at the apex of that moisture tongue ahead of the surface low. So, and again, this is why the SPC really just has a marginal risk at this point. It's the instability. Instability appears to be on the weaker side here. And this is at 21Z, 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Very skinny cape, surface temperatures in the 60s. And this could be a NAM bias as well. Some of the models, I believe, are showing a more robust surface heating out here. You see the GFS has some 70-degree temperatures out there here, whereas the NAM has just basically low to mid-60s at best. Let's see if the Euro has anything here. The Euro showing some slightly higher temperatures as well. So the NAM is a little bit on the cool side, and this is why the SPC only has a marginal risk out for this point. The degree of destabilization behind any morning convection and the degree of surface heating is really going to modulate the severe threat. If we can get those temperatures up into the very upper 60s to low 70s, then we'll have a chance of destabilizing. Not going to be a lot of instability, but enough in this kind of environment to support a supercell threat out ahead of the surface low. So assuming we can get enough instability, we should have a nice environment for tornadoes. You see, even in this kind of skinny cape environment, 0 to 3 kilometer cape, about 100 joules per kilogram, more than adequate to help stretch any of that spin into the vertical very efficiently to promote tornadic supercells here. You can see that the low-level shear definitely on the weaker side, but that is not all that uncommon in these cold core type setups. You're definitely removed. Generally, you are removed from the strongest low-level flow. You'll see the 850 millibar flow here, at least according to the NAM, is going to be well off to the east. Once this loads here, it will be well off to the east. You see that plume of kind of 30 to 40 knots of flow well displaced here from our area of interest in southeast Iowa. So the low-level flow, not often very strong in these cold core type setups, but that doesn't matter because if you have spin out ahead of the surface low, lots of surface vorticity there to work with, lots of spin at the surface, that will be very efficiently stretched into the vertical to support a tornado threat and aid in tornadogenesis with any low-top supercells that develop. So the question for Friday remains instability. If we get enough destabilization behind the morning round, we could see a few low-top supercells with a tornado and maybe sporadic large hail threat if we can get enough sunshine and destabilization behind the morning round of storms and into the afternoon. So that is the main question there with Friday's threat, but if we can get enough destabilization, I am definitely got some alarm bells going for a tornado threat with a cold core, very classic cold core setup there, somewhere in the Iowa, northeast Missouri, western Illinois vicinity. All right, let's take a look at some convective allowing models here. We'll start off with tomorrow. Not going to put too much stock into these, as always. This far out, the cams are never that good more than a few hours out from an event, but just to get an idea of what the cams have, we'll take a look at starting with tomorrow. So here we go into tonight. You see a bunch of convection blossoms there across Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota tonight. Again, all elevated, mostly elevated with a just sporadic large hail and damaging wind threat. Then we go into tomorrow. You see by about 17 to 18Z, that's right about midday to early afternoon, lots of convection blossoms there on the surface low in Nebraska. Couple of low top supercells there, maybe just kind of that string of pearls there right on the surface low. And again, don't put too much stock into location at this point, but somewhere here in central Nebraska should be a nice arc of supercells come tomorrow morning. And again, I wouldn't put too much stock into these, especially with these types of setups. With these low instability type setups, the herd tends to do, or these cams in general tend to do very poorly in denoting kind of helicity streaks and rotating storms. So if you don't see those big black helicity streaks, don't be too alarmed, because the low instability is probably leading to that in these storms not looking as robust on the cams. But Could have kind of an arc of supercells here in central Nebraska by early to mid-afternoon, and then we'll see additional development down along the dryline and cold front come tomorrow. Could see some activity as far south as Oklahoma along the cold front tomorrow evening, but that is in question. Those would be maybe sporadically severe, but nothing too interesting to worry about there, with additional development as the cold front overtakes the dryline there into Kansas. Let's take a look at another model here. We'll look at the ARW model. So again, lots of convection overnight going into tomorrow mid-afternoon or so, and you see a couple of supercells develop there by mid-afternoon or so there in east central Nebraska. Those would have the best tornado threat right ahead of the surface low there, where the stretching potential from the strong low-level instability is best, and then additional development in Kansas by early evening, and then as the cold front overtakes the dry line, could have additional convection going into Friday morning. NSSL WRF model here, just kind of going through each cam to get a consensus view of what's going on. You can see by midday, start to get that kind of arc of supercells there in north central Nebraska, out ahead of the surface low, additional development there in Kansas. So cams are very much on the same page here, it looks like, with the progression of the event. Looks like by midday or so, storms fire there in central Nebraska, somewhere in the central Nebraska vicinity, and then additional development down the dry line in Kansas is possible, especially when the cold front overtakes it going into the early evening hours. We'll look at the FV3 model, just for kicks, and you see there, midday or so, some possible supercells there, arc of supercells there in north central Nebraska, and then things kind of go from there. All right, let's look at Friday. We don't have a ton of cams that are out for Friday yet. So some of these only go out to Friday at 12Z. The FV3 is out far enough to give us a threat, and again, this is give us a look at Friday. This is even worse to look at cams this far out, but just for kicks here, let's see what these models are showing for Friday. So this is the FV3 going into Friday. You see a lot of convection early on, but then as the dry slot moves in behind, we do kind of get this arc of convection across the eastern half of Iowa. Those would have the potential to be low-topped tornadic supercells if we can get enough destabilization. The FV3 certainly is showing enough destabilization for a cold core type tornado threat up there. We will look at the NAM 3K here. I don't like the NAM 3K at all. It is a pretty bad model, but just for kicks, we'll see what it shows as well. You see lots of morning convection on Friday, and then it does kind of have an arc, tries to develop some convection there in Iowa, but again, these models will struggle this far out, and especially with these types of cold core setups. So at least the models are kind of all on the same page for tomorrow. Certainly looks like an interesting day, the next, especially tomorrow and then on Friday. So that's going to wrap things up here. Hopefully this gave you a look at the severe threat for the next couple of days. Again, today, just as a quick reminder, marginal risk out for today, level 1 of 5 from eastern Nebraska and South Dakota down through Iowa and Illinois for the overnight hours for a mostly elevated storm threat with a sporadic large hail and damaging wind risk. Slight risk there in the Florida Panhandle as well as that low moves off in the Gulf, moves off to the northeast and strengthens the wind fields there. A few tornadoes, damaging winds possible through tomorrow morning. And then we get into tomorrow, which is kind of the main event within this sequence. Slight risk, level 2 of 5, from central and northern Nebraska down through southeast Nebraska, eastern Kansas. All hazards on the table. Again, alarm bells are going off. Looks like a classic surface low tornado day up in central Nebraska tomorrow. SBC reflects that with a 5% risk there, centered on central Nebraska with a 2% area surrounding that. Damaging wind and large hail a possibility as well. And then we go into Friday. Again, some uncertainty remains as far as destabilization goes and the location of the pertinent features. But if we can get enough destabilization behind the morning round of storms on Friday, which is fairly common in these cold core type setups, we could see a very nice cold core type tornado threat develop somewhere from southeast Iowa into northeast Missouri, western Illinois, somewhere in there. Would not be surprised to see an upgrade in future outlook cycles if we can get some more confidence in the progression of Friday's event. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.